Come with us for a moment, into a chapter of history where victories were not claimed by gunfire alone, but by timing, nerve, and unspoken calculations. Picture the final weeks of World War II, Europe still smoldering, cities shattered, and the fate of nations hanging by a thread. Now imagine a bold advance that made the world hold its breath, an advance that pushed General Patton's army straight into the Soviet occupation zone before the Soviets themselves could get there. And in that tense silence, all eyes turned toward one man, Dwight D. Eisenhower. What would he say? What would he do? Let us take you to the moment where maps, ambitions, and destiny collided. When the last snows of the European winter melted into brown water swamps along the Elbe, the lines on the war maps looked as if they had hardened forever. American arrows thrust in from the west, Soviet ones from the east, both converging over the broken carcass of Nazi Germany. But lines on maps are fragile things, and in April 1945, George S. Patton had no patience for fragility. He drove the Third Army as if history were chasing behind him with a whip. Towns fell one after another, Fulda, Hersfeld, Erfurt, until the German defenses looked less like resistance and more like exhaustion. Reporters noted that his armored divisions moved with the rhythm of inevitability, as if they believed they could outrun the war itself. And for a brief, electric moment, it looked as though Patton would outrun something far more dangerous, the timetable of Allied diplomacy. The Soviets had been promised a zone of occupation in central Germany, a prize of blood paid for by 20 million dead and the scorched earth of Stalingrad, Kursk, Kiev, and Minsk. Their advance had been brutal and uncompromising, sweeping over East Prussia and into Saxony with the momentum of vengeance. The secret expectation in Washington and London was that the Red Army would reach the assigned zone first. But Patton did not read expectations, he read opportunity. And the closer he got to the planned Soviet line, the more it looked like a dare. By mid-April his units were receiving scattered intelligence from German officers surrendering in disordered clusters. They spoke of collapsing Soviet logistics, of bridges strained to breaking, and of a Red Army pausing to consolidate for a final push on Berlin. Patton, scenting a vacuum, ordered his lead elements forward with what his staff later called quiet aggression. And then it happened, first in the early hours of a cold dawn, when a reconnaissance troop of the 4th Armored Division pushed through a forest road and, after passing a sign written in crooked Cyrillic letters, realized they had crossed into territory the British and Americans had already promised to Stalin. The first reaction was disbelief. Lieutenant reporters scribbled furiously as officers spread maps across jeep hoods and mess tables. The lines did not lie. Patton's advance guard had entered the Soviet zone. And not in a symbolic handful of meters but several kilometers, with more to follow if orders remained unchanged. Patton, when informed, did not ask for apology or permission. He is said to have nodded once, then reportedly remarked that boundaries agreed in rooms far away should not restrain armies that had earned the right to push forward. News traveled upward fast, faster than tanks. Eisenhower received the first signal before breakfast. The Supreme Commander had no illusions about what this meant. For months he had navigated the strained alliance with Stalin with precise diplomatic stitching, aware that the war in Europe might end with a handshake or with a glare capable of igniting another war. Rumors had already circulated that Patton believed the Western Allies should beat the Soviets to Prague, to Vienna, even, under some imagined miracle, to Berlin. Eisenhower read the message in silence, keeping his face a mask. And then he asked for a fresh map. The room held generals who had seen too much of war to trust hope. On the map the line of Patton's advance glowed like a new fracture across the continent. Eisenhower's staff worried privately about Stalin's temper. He had already suspected Churchill of plotting against him, already accused the West of dragging its feet to bleed Russia. If the Red Army arrived to find Americans occupying the promised zone, words could sharpen into ultimatums and weapons might speak for diplomacy. The war with Germany was ending, but war with the Soviet Union was not inconceivable. Eisenhower dismissed most of the room, retaining only his closest advisors. He asked questions in short bursts. Where was Zhukov's spearhead? How far were Konev's forward battalions? Could Patton be halted without revealing panic? The answers came in imperfect fragments. Nobody knew anything for certain except that the map now contained a problem that did not wear a swastika. That afternoon, Eisenhower drafted a message. The wording was deliberate, stripped of ego, free of theatricality. He would not rebuke Patton publicly, he would not make Stalin grin or Churchill smirk. But he would assert control. When asked later what Eisenhower said when Patton's army crossed into the Soviet zone first, officers who were present recalled a statement both weary and sharp: "We are here to end one war, not to begin the next." To his staff he added a colder directive: pull him back to the line. "I will not trade Berlin for another Europe in ashes." But privately, always privately, Eisenhower confided that Patton's instincts were not mad. The Soviets were not merely partners in victory, they were soon to be rivals in peace. Eisenhower believed in avoiding provocations, but he also understood their value. In one recorded conversation, he stated that the crossing would serve as a useful reminder in the Kremlin that the American army was not slow, not weak, and not resigned to second place. "Let them know," he said, without forcing them to test it. The next test was diplomacy. Stalin demanded clarification through the Soviet liaison officers, who treated the incident as if it were a chess opening. Were the Americans probing? Were they signaling doubt about prior agreements? Or were they merely overeager? The Soviets proposed a meeting in a temporary government building near Torgau, where the Americans had sent a delegation whose uniforms still smelled faintly of engine oil. Patton himself was not invited. There, the Soviets accepted the explanation that the crossing was tactical rather than political, though their acceptance carried the brittle undertone of suspicion. With the Germans collapsing, one Soviet general muttered, "Everyone is eager for trophies." While diplomats normalized the breach, the soldiers on the ground lived the tension silently. Along wooded ridges, American reconnaissance troops watched Soviet scouts peering back through binoculars. Neither side fired. Neither waved. Both understood that the war's last shots would be wasted if they killed the wrong enemy. Sometimes an American jeep would roll forward to offer cigarettes, sometimes a Soviet motorcycle patrol would respond with tins of tobacco or captured schnapps. The exchange felt less like friendship and more like an acknowledgement that history was changing guard. Patton, from his headquarters, chafed at the recall order. He reportedly told one aide that retreating from a position won on speed and blood was something kings would do, not soldiers. But the recall held. The Third Army withdrew a short distance to the agreed demarcation, marking the movement with bitterness disguised as discipline. Patton would soon say that, "We fought the wrong enemy," a remark that ignited fury in Washington and gave Moscow confirmation of its worst suspicions. Eisenhower never forgave the sentiment, not because it was dangerous, but because it was unnecessary. As Germany surrendered in early May, the brief moment when Patton's columns sat ahead of the Soviet clock vanished into memory. The newspapers printed the triumphant photographs of American and Soviet soldiers shaking hands over the Elbe, smiling with the exhaustion of men who believed peace had arrived. Yet behind the smiles, the new world was already forming. Stalin asked for intelligence on the quality of American armor. Churchill requested estimates on how many divisions would be required to push the Soviets out of Europe if diplomacy failed. Washington wondered if the atomic bomb might change the entire equation before such estimates mattered. Looking back, the crossing became a story whispered rather than proclaimed. Eisenhower, when asked in later years about Patton's incursion, spoke of it with soft restraint. He repeated that line, "End one war, not begin the next," as if it summed up the entire future of Europe. But those who studied the beginning of the Cold War would later argue that moment in April, when Patton briefly outran the Red Army, was the first time the alliance cracked in daylight. It was a reminder that even as Berlin smoked and Hitler's Reich collapsed into ruins, the next contest had already begun in the shadows cast by victory. For the soldiers who were there, the memory stayed vivid. Men who had fought through Normandy, Lorraine, and the Ardennes would recall how strange it felt to see a new potential enemy only meters away, both sides armed, both victorious, both uncertain. They said it was the quiet that made it tense, the quiet of a war ending too smoothly for everyone to trust peace. One infantryman said decades later that he knew the war was over not when the Germans surrendered, but when the Soviets did not fire. In the end, Eisenhower's response became an example of how wars finish not with glory but with calculation. He refused to let Patton's competitive fury set the tone for the peace. He refused to let Stalin assume that the West was timid. And he refused to let Europe burn again just because a boundary came too early on a map. The balance was imperfect, but it held long enough for a Cold War to begin without a hot one restarting. And so the answer to what Eisenhower said when Patton's army crossed into the Soviet zone first was not heroic or cinematic or even memorable in the way generals prefer. It was a sentence said quietly, under fluorescent lights, to men who understood the stakes: pull him back. We have beaten Germany. Do not make us beat Russia too. And that was the moment that didn't just close a war, it opened the first page of a new one. Patton's advance wasn't celebrated with cheers, it was measured in calculations, warnings, and quiet glances toward Moscow. Eisenhower's final words on that incident did more than settle a dispute, they drew the first invisible line of the Cold War. The guns fell silent, but the tension did not. If you want to hear the real history, history that changed the world long before the world understood it, then stay with us. More events like this are waiting, hidden between victories and headlines. Make sure you don't miss what comes next.